welcome to a brand new episode of Seize the Moment podcast. And today we have a very special guest. We have Darryl Stickel. He's devoted his career to understanding trust, what it is, how it functions, and how to increase it. He holds a PhD in business from Duke University. And before founding Trust Unlimited in 2001, he was a consultant at McKinsey and Company, the world-renowned global management consulting firm. Since then, he's helped leaders build trust in a wide range of businesses and personal environments, including financial services, telecoms, high tech, families, and the Canadian military in Afghanistan. He's also a professor at the Luxembourg School of Business, teaching in the MBA program and in their executive education program. And his new book out now is called Building Trust, Exceptional Leadership in an Uncertain World. Welcome, Darryl.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Absolutely, man. So, as I was going through your books, the thing that kind of struck me and stuck out to me the most, being that I'm a CBT therapist, and obviously Alan and I cover kind of cognitive biases and the way we make mistakes in our thinking, is your framework about sort of how people kind of build and I guess sort of demolish trust in other people, right? So obviously a lot of what this book focuses on is trust, right? And so I want to first read a passage and then I actually want to get into it. So in this one, Darryl writes, when we like someone, we have a positive story about them. We search for confirming evidence of that story, and we are more likely to trust them. When it comes time to evaluate our interactions with people we like, we are more likely to view those interactions positively, once again confirming our story about them. If we see the outcome of the interaction as positive, we are more likely to give them credit for that positive outcome. If the outcome can't be seen as anything but negative, we likely blame the outcome on the situation, the context, rather than the person we like. This whole process can cause us to like these people even more, creating a virtuous cycle. And then obviously reading on, you kind of say that the opposite is true too, where a person, if they have already a negative perception of somebody, it sort of becomes skewed by the confirmation bias. So it's just kind of like, so it's both sort of really obviously fascinating, but then it's also a bit kind of like demoralizing, right? Because it's like, if these cognitive biases sort of prevent us from forming accurate opinions of other people, then like, what are we supposed to do? How do we actually get to build trust with other people and actually, form relationships with them?
That's a great question. And that's the heart of why we seem to have these long-term disputes, is a lot of the research follows a cognitive rational actor perspective. So they treat everyone as though they're a rational actor. And I don't know if you guys have ever met people before, but we're not always rational.
Yeah.
And so partly this is at the extremes. Everything starts to break down. And you guys won't have noticed this living in the U.S. with Republicans and Democrats, but at the extremes, we become irrational. There's still a lot of space in between those extremes where we can have positive influence. We can start to try to build trusting relationships. And I've been plunked into the middle of some really difficult spots and seen traction, right? So it's just a heads up that we need to be aware of the story that other people are telling. And we actually need to talk to them about that story and share our own story so that we have a more complete picture and are able to build trust more effectively with one another. We need to try to reset those emotional states or generate mildly positive ones if we can.
Yeah. And then so just thinking it through, right? Because it seems like such an automatic process. What would you do? And so let's just go into the model itself, right? So first of all, What is it that sort of, how do we build trust? And then how is it that, like, in terms of these actual barriers, how do we begin kind of thinking about them in, I guess, a more of a constructive way, and maybe battling them is the wrong term, but sort of combating them in a way?
Oh, yeah. So there are a number of challenges. When people are deciding whether to trust someone, they ask themselves two fundamental questions. And the first question is, how likely am I to be harmed, which is perceived uncertainty. And the second question is, if I'm harmed, how bad is it going to hurt, which is perceived vulnerability. And so those things combine, uncertainty times vulnerability gives us a level of perceived risk. And if our perception of the risk goes beyond the threshold we're comfortable with, we don't trust. If it's beneath it, then we do. And so from a cognitive perspective, building trust is fairly simple. It's, where does uncertainty come from and how do we take steps to reduce that? Where does vulnerability come from? How do we take steps to help people manage that? And, we think about relationships. Shallow relationships have high levels of uncertainty, which means they can only tolerate small ranges of vulnerability. deeper relationships have low levels of uncertainty, which means that we can accept a broader range of vulnerability. And so the challenge then becomes, well, where does uncertainty come from, and how do we take steps to proactively reduce it? How do we be more intentional? And where do those perceptions of vulnerability come from, and how do we take steps to reduce those? And this actually helps explain why trust has been in such significant dramatic decline over the last decade, because levels of uncertainty have gone up, particularly around the pandemic, around debates that we're having about global warming, about gun control, about geopolitical events, about gender or race, all of these things, and the changing norms and values that we're seeing have all significantly increased uncertainty. And we haven't really been all that systematic about reducing it or even thinking about it. We see this with virtual teams. We see it, popping up all over the place where, our intent remains the same and our habits remain the same, but the context has changed. And so that's the approach that I take, and it actually gives people traction. A lot of the leaders I work with, or the people I work with, report remarkable change fairly quickly because they're actually able to be thoughtful about what levers they're pulling and how to be more intentional in the relationships that they have. And you asked about some of the barriers. Well, there's some real challenges that we face. One of which is that 95% of people think they're more trustworthy than average.
Mm-hmm.
And aside from being statistically impossible, it also means that when we run into a trust problem, even if we manage to somehow miraculously identify it as such, we think it's somebody else's problem.
Mm-hmm.
And so we don't engage ourselves. And people, there's a subset of people who think that trust is too complex. There's just nothing you can do about it. And that's not true. I've spent 20 years helping individuals and organizations, and I've got a litany of stories about remarkable turnarounds. And executives I've worked with who've had incredible experiences. So we know that this is something we can systematically work on.
What's fascinating about your book, what I find very interesting, is that a lot of the literature out there about trust, like, for example, I can't probably, due to our social media policy, maybe talk about what company I work at, but I work at a telecoms company. And essentially, a lot of our corporate trainings do talk about the importance of trustworthiness, right? In the environment, and in terms of building relationships with other team members, but they don't always go over ways to build trust, right? We just know that's an important factor. But what I love about your book is you actually talk about ways to sort of cultivate that trust. And I was just wanted to ask, what are some, maybe as you put it in the book, what are some levers maybe that we can use in order to foster or build more trust with our teammates or in relationships?
Yeah, and that's a source of real frustration for me, because there's some people with really big platforms who are talking about trust in such an abstract way that there's really not a lot we can do about it. And so, when I start thinking about trust, I think we all have the capacity to build trust. Some are better than others. And those who aren't very good have a lever that they pull. Usually it's the ability lever, right? And you talked about the notion of trustworthiness. So there was a great article written by Roger Mayer and his colleagues in 1995. And it's been the impetus for a lot of the work, the popular press work on trust. They talk about three elements that drive perceptions of trustworthiness. So those are benevolence, integrity, and ability. Benevolence is the belief you've got my best interest at heart. Integrity is, that you follow through on promises and that your actions align with the values you express. And then ability is, do I have the competence to do what I say I'm going to do? So we see people pull the ability lever all the time. I have these kinds of academic credentials. I have this kind of background, this much experience, and so that lever gets used a lot. But what if the gap isn't there? What if the gap is around benevolence or integrity, or what if we don't understand the context very well? And so, when I I'll talk with families because I've done work with families who are trying to build stronger relationships within the family unit. And I'll say to the parents, I'll say, who here has their kids' best interest at heart? And all the hands go up, right? And when you flip that question and say, well, how many of your kids would say that? You get about a third, right? And
Wow.
it's somewhat hesitant. And so if they're struggling in a place where it's supposed to be obvious, how do we do that? How do you guys do that as podcasters, or how does a leader do that, or how does your organization do that?
Right.
And in large part, we start asking people about the conversations they could have. And the approach that I've started to take, because I think so much of the training and development work that we do is fire and forget. There are shockingly small numbers around how much of training or education we actually retain and use. And so I've been working really hard to get people to actually start applying the concepts, because that's how we see behavior change. And so for me, we've created a trust canvas that has a set of questions you can ask. So let's take benevolence as an example. I was working with one of my MBA students in Luxembourg. And what I do is I get them to focus on a relationship. And so I said, tell me what relationship you're going to focus on. And he said, well, my girlfriend. I said, great. So tonight you're going to go home and you're going to say to your girlfriend, my instructor asked me to think about a relationship that really mattered to me, and I thought about you. So that's step one of showing benevolence. I'm thinking about the other person, and I'm transparent about that. So then you're going to say, he asked me what mattered most to you. And I said, family. Is that right? And I said, when she says, yeah, that's right. Well, you're now inviting her to be part of the conversation and including her in the decision about what matters most to her. And when she says yes, then you're going to say, well, then I assume that it matters to you that I get along well with your family. So I'm going to start spending more time with them. I'm going to have lunches. I'm going to call them. I'm going to be more open and transparent with them because it matters to you. And I said, now we've actually surfaced what matters, and we've shown that we're taking steps to act in a way that's benevolent. We've been transparent about that. And he came back the next day and he said, wow, did that ever go well? My girlfriend says I'm allowed to talk to you whenever I want. And so we start to see people actually pulling that lever. And what we start to do is give people scripts that, just getting out there and practicing having a conversation about trust, because it feels fuzzy. And one of the things I try to do with the model I use with the conversation around levers is clarify and bring a bit of simplicity. I've had tech guys who are, they've got people skills like you read about. And they say, oh my God, you've given me a manual to actually deal with people. And I now have a formula that I can use. And I can go through and the success I'm having in my relationships in life is dramatically improved. And so, we'll start people off with a really easy sort of first conversation. We'll say, hey, I'm taking this course on trust. I've decided to try to be more intentional about my relationships. I'm supposed to practice with someone. Would you be willing to practice with me? And the response is incredibly positive and powerful for them. And then it gives them that positive reinforcement to, hey, this stuff actually works. And they start to add it to their toolkit. So I said those who aren't very good at building trust have a lever that they pull. Those who are a bit better have multiple levers. And I list 10 in the book. And those who are really good have multiple levers and they know when to pull which one. And so what we do in the book and what I do in the courses I deliver and the workshops and all that stuff is I show people the levers and show them how to pull them. And then they start to get a chance to practice them and they start to be able to diagnose a little bit on their own.
Yeah, and it's like our culture is super interesting because I think we mainly focus on the ability portion. So I've said
Yeah.
this before, and this is a bit embarrassing to talk about, but like when I was, I don't know, maybe a novice or whatever, I can't even say this was that long ago, but when I would go on dates, I would frequently talk about all of the reasons why that person should like me, like have a litany of accomplishments, right?
Right.
Yeah. And it's like not only, I mean, I don't think that that in itself is a terrible thing, but like I would hyper focus on them and kind of, pretty much it was excessive. So then I, try to figure out like what is it that's going wrong about my dates. I'm doing all of these great things. I have this like list of achievements. Why isn't this person impressed by me?
My first probably thought on that is you're probably talking too much about yourself and not asking about them,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
There
So
you
yeah.
go.
Yeah, and then yeah, exactly right. So it's like when we think about building trust, right? If we're thinking about benevolence, right? So that would be the component that I would think that I'm missing. Because if we're thinking about benevolence, what I think you're saying is that the person sort of gets equal airtime, right?
Also, I mean, there's nothing wrong with demonstrating value and sort of explaining why you're valuable in a way.
Sure.
It's just that too much of that is
Mhm.
probably what might have not made it go well.
Yeah.
Probably.
Yeah, and
I'm
Dale, so
guessing.
I think what you're saying is that like when you're looking at the model, all of these components are equally as necessary. You can't just have one as opposed to the others.
Well, there's a minimum threshold for each,
Mhm.
right? And when we're looking for a brain surgeon, we're not looking for someone who's going to say nice things to us. We're looking for someone who's incredibly competent and has a steady hand. One of the challenges that we face, though, is that we assume what excellence looks like for other people, and we don't often include them in that conversation. So when I deal with senior executives, I'll say to them, "Who here is a great leader?" And all the hands will go up again, and I'll say, "Great, what does that mean?" And you get this long, uncomfortable silence.
Mhm.
And then somebody will say, "Well, it's just something I thought I should think I'm good at." And so then we start to unpack it, and we say, "Well, have you seen people who are great leaders? What was it about them that made you say, yeah, that's a great leader? And who should be involved in that conversation?" And so, when you go on your dates, it actually be helpful to know what they think great looks like, what ability looks like. Because part of that may be someone who's a great listener, right? And so we need to be able to adopt the other person's perspective a bit if we're trying to build trust with them. And a lot of times I'll have leaders say to me, "Well, I do all those things." And my response will be, "Says who?" It doesn't matter if I tell you that I'm great. It matters if you think I'm great.
Right.
And this same piece around benevolence is if we don't include the other person in that conversation, then we're making guesses. And sometimes we're right. Sometimes we're not. Right? Imagine you guys are walking past me and I'm sitting having dinner with someone and I'm having this huge dessert, and you stop and you go, "Wow, Darryl, you're really not going to eat that, are you?"
Mhm.
And you think you have my best interest at heart, but maybe it doesn't land quite that well, right? Because this body doesn't just happen, guys. I mean, there's years of neglect involved. And so, we have to actually find a way to surface from the other person what the best interests are, what benevolence would look like for them. And again, a large part, we start with the conversation. So we'll say, "Hey, remember I'm taking that course on trust? Well, one of the things they talked about was benevolence, having someone else's best interest at heart." And I think I do that, but it doesn't always seem to land that way. Have you ever experienced that? And now you're pulling the other person into that conversation. And they'll say, "Oh God, yeah, I've, with my aunt or my cousin or my brother or my sister." Um, and they'll start reminiscing about moments where they tried to do what was best, the whole "no good deed goes unpunished" thing.
Mhm.
And then you sort of start to narrow the funnel. When you say, "Well, have you ever had somebody really act in your best interest, like where you just really felt it? What was that like? What did they do?" And so now you're starting to surface from them what benevolence looks like for them, and you're getting hints about how you could be benevolent. And then you narrow the funnel even further, and you say, "What would it look like if I was benevolent to you? What does success look like for you, and how do I help you get there?" And again, it's a profound conversation. And this is one of the levers I get people to pull when I'm advising them about job searches. Because when we're interviewing for a job, we pull the ability lever really hard and consistently.
Mhm.
And if we flip that a little bit and say, what are the biggest challenges here and how can I help fix them? Or what is your role and how does it overlap with this role you're hiring for? And what would a good colleague look like? Or what are some of the challenges you're facing? How can I help you be successful? All of a sudden it changes the dynamic, because remember, we're not just hiring a set of skills, we're hiring a human being that we're going to have to interact with for months or years. And we'd much rather have somebody we're comfortable with and we like being around. You know, and I got to tell you, the success rate for people who follow that advice is really high. Yeah.
I think this was maybe about a couple of weeks ago or so. I was watching this video on Facebook. I believe it was with Simon Sinek, and he was doing this little clip of his. He was talking about trustworthiness, right? And he's talking about the Marines and how they sort of select, you know, the best of the best, and who goes on that team of 5 or so people, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
And then he had this sort of graph, and one was measuring their ability, one part of the graph, and the other part was their level of trustworthiness. And then he started talking about, well, he started asking the audience, would you rather have somebody of high ability, low trustworthiness, or low ability, low trustworthiness, right? And then he started getting into, well, actually what they select for in these teams is actually somebody either of a low ability, high trustworthiness, or medium ability, medium trustworthiness. And they never look at the person who, even though their metrics are fantastic and amazing, if they're not trustworthy, how could you trust them with your life or whatever on the team? And I found that very fascinating, because very technically speaking, I mean, if you did select someone to be on your team that is of low ability but high trustworthiness, I mean, it probably, you could kind of get the sense that maybe you can, you know, train them on those skills to up their ability. But trustworthiness is, I mean, sure, that can be trained for sure.
That's a clinical disorder, man. Because for that person would need therapy, I think, at that point.
Which person?
The low trustworthiness one, right? Because it's like you could train ability, but when we're thinking of trustworthiness, you're probably thinking years of therapy.
Well, there's that, and then, well, I mean, also this book is a great resource on ways to do that. But the thing is, it seems to be harder though to train trustworthiness, which is why they select for that first. And I thought that was interesting and connects to what you're talking about. Yeah,
absolutely. And you know, one of the pieces of research that I've seen recently is a piece that looks at what lever is most important for leaders versus those they lead. And for leaders, they're most concerned about competence, right? They care about ability. They want their subordinates to be able to do the tasks they're supposed to do. And so it has primacy. The other levers still matter, right? But the one that they sort of weigh the most heavily is ability. For subordinates, it's benevolence. And so they're more concerned that their boss has their back, that their boss has the best interest of the organization and them in mind when they're making decisions. And when we start to think about how quickly things are changing, the definition for ability is a moving target. So what makes a great leader today is not the same as what made a great leader a decade ago. And integrity has become more challenging because it's hard to follow through on longer term commitments because the world keeps changing so quickly.
Right.
And you know, the notions of what good values are seems to be a moving target. But benevolence is the piece that sticks, right? I can tell you that I'm going to look out for your best interest no matter what happens. And that's more stable than a lot of the other levers.
Yeah. And then, you know, I'm thinking just in terms of like the kind of positive referential beliefs that we have about ourselves. It's like, you know, going back to obviously that initial paragraph that I read, it's so hard to just think of the fact that, like, you know, we have these kind of biases, but like for some people it's negative, some people it's positive, right? So it's really interesting how that works. So like clinically speaking, if let's say somebody's high in the narcissism spectrum, they're going to obviously just continue to confirm that they're an amazing person. But on the opposite end of the spectrum, if they either have borderline personality disorder or vulnerable narcissism, the idea is they just kind of keep looking at the negative information and sort of keep, let's say, I don't know, whatever, fostering or whatever you'd want to call it, sort of, let's say, if you look at it kind of like as a bubble of self-esteem, it's like the negative self-image just grows and grows and grows with each kind of confirming piece of evidence. So it's like, here's the kind of major question then I think that we would have. If 95% of people think that we're above average parents, we're smarter than kind of, again, the norm or the average, if we think we're just better overall humans, right? How do we begin to start to tackle that? Because people don't really like to be kind of reduced to even the average. People don't like to be told, well, hey, I know you think that like you're the best parent in the world, but it's not kind of possible, or at least it's very unlikely considering the fact that 95% of you guys think that you're the best parents in the world, right? So how do we begin to address that, but in a way that doesn't necessarily just completely deflate one's ego or self-esteem?
Right. And so I think partly this is a conversation around skill building, right? That building trust is a skill we can all improve at. And it's one of the ways. So I try to motivate a lot of these conversations by telling people why trust matters for them, in different settings. When I have a new client, I'll say, trust is really, it drives value, and it really drives value for you. And no matter where you are on the continuum of your ability to build trust, we can help you move to a better place. And really, it's about becoming more intentional about those skills. And so it's not about coming in and sort of rattling people's cages and saying you suck. It's more around, the world's gotten more challenging, and leaders that we talk to, they vacillate between trust is really important and trust is the most important thing for them as a leader. Because think about this, the more senior you become, the less direct control you have over outcomes, the more dependent you are on the people that report to you for any success. And so you're vulnerable to those folks. And that's why we've seen some bizarre behavior from leaders with the advent of virtual teams, where they can't keep an eye on people, and the spike in uncertainty that they're experiencing. They're getting really uncomfortable. And so, we need to have this conversation in a way that doesn't diminish people. You're absolutely right. It's got to be a way that sort of gives them hope about things that they can improve and work on. I've seen some organizations that are measuring trust levels and telling people it's important, but then not giving them any tools in order to get stronger at it or fix it, which puts them in such a difficult place. And so I think that if people are given feedback, and this is what I used to do with my sons, is I would come to them and I'd say, they played hockey. I'd say, you had a great game. Here's the things you did well. Now, would you like to hear some feedback? And they would always say, yeah, I want to get better. Okay. And so once we've included people in that conversation around, how do I strengthen this? How do I turn this from, something I'm average at or really good at to something I'm exceptional at? And it gives them an intentionality. And I got to tell you, a lot of times when I say, we're going to do a trust course, people show up really hesitant because they think we're going to hold hands and we're going to sing Kumbaya and we're going to fall off of things. And that's not it at all, right? This is a very practical, applied approach to helping people better understand the mental model that people are using when they build trust.
Yeah.
So I guess if, let's say I had a team that I work with, right, essentially,
Right.
and I wanted to build trust with them along the lines of, the methods that we're discussing here. I guess asking them what I can do to maybe be a better leader for them, or what is it they would like to see more, like kind of, because I realize that including them in the conversation seems to be a big factor here, because I could probably believe I'm being benevolent anytime I ask someone, oh, do you need help with this? I have your back, and things like that. And not just saying it, of course, being aligned in my words, actions, behaviors, being congruent, right? As you talk about in the book. But yeah, I think what you're sort of inspiring me to do is also include them by asking, what is it you kind of expect or would like to see more of? That maybe like a good thing to try to do?
That's a big part of it. And it's having the same vocabulary seems to be really powerful. So I have done some work with SAP, a huge global software company. And the benefits of that have been that they're global. So I've had a chance to try the model in different parts of Asia and North America and South America and all over Europe, and it seems to hold. But it's also been some real practical applied experience. They use a measure to measure trust levels for their leaders. They're one of the organizations that does that. Now, I'm not crazy about the measure they use, but they actually ask the question. And I had, a leader that I worked with whose score was 13 out of 100. And their score goes from negative 100 to positive 100. And I knew that this person was capable and competent and caring and had the potential to be a great leader. And so what I did was, we coached her for a bit, but then I came in and talked with her team. And I said, here's how trust works. And so I took a lot of the ambiguity out of it. And it made the conversation so much easier, right? Because if I say to you, do you trust me? And you say, no, my feelings get hurt. And now you're uncomfortable saying that in the future because there may be repercussions. But if I say to you, there's elements of uncertainty and vulnerability here, how uncertain are you? That's an easier conversation. And if I say, how vulnerable are you feeling? That's an easier conversation. And so we walked through the model, and I said, so benevolence is one of the levers. What could she do to show benevolence? And it formed a conversation that gave her some practical things that she could do, but it also gave them the language to use in the future. And, here's what integrity is. So are there commitments that she's making that she's not following through on? Are there actions that she or the organization are taking that don't seem to align with the values they've expressed? And then here's competence. What's a good leader look like? And now let's explore the context. How do we explain the rules of the game in a way that, because the context constrains our behavior, right? So we do certain things because we have to, or because our job description dictates them, or because we don't want to look bad. And after we'd had that conversation, they redid the assessment 3 months later. She got an 80. And so 13 to 80, and now she's at 100 and thriving, right? And so those stories come up over and over and over again. When we give people the tools to actually do something, it's such a relief for so many of them.
Yeah, and it makes me think like when we're thinking about integrity, it seems to me like well, obviously it goes without saying that integrity is super important, but it just made me think of an example where like a lot of times when we figure out like what a person actually thinks about us, or like just the way they kind of see the relationship on the whole, we often find it out from other people. So I had a conversation with one of my clients the other day. So he's a kid, and so he was worried about his dad, and he said, like my dad is like I think he's going to judge me, I think he's going to like really be upset with me. So the kind of context of this was that he essentially didn't want to get his driver's license. He didn't feel like he was ready to, because he has a ton of anxiety. And he's like, I'm just like afraid that my dad's going to like really be upset with me. And so he tells me I had like a freak out, like a huge, just like hysterical attack. Right. And so, I said to him, I had a conversation with him and saying that, I said, like, look, man, I was like, I have like patients that I've seen before whose parents are like pretty critical. Right. So they would call me and they would kind of complain, and they would say, oh, well, I just don't understand why my kid can't do this right, or why he can't get his stuff together. This is what therapy needs to focus on, yada, yada, just a litany of complaints. Right. So I'm like, okay, I get it, right? In your mind, you want the best for your kid, and this is how you think you can kind of go about doing it, by telling the therapist, here are all of the things wrong, you kind of go and fix it, right? So, but then I was telling this kid, I was like, man, your dad is probably the only person that legit never complains about you, never says anything negative. So whenever he and I have a conversation, the first question is, okay, how can I help him? Like, what is it? What are you seeing, or what are you picking up on that I'm just not getting from him? And what is it that I could do to help him, whatever direction that, he wants to go in. So it's so fascinating, man, because on the other hand, you have like parents who just, again, they're like, oh, how do I like mold this kid into what I want him to be? But then on the other hand, we're obviously thinking about this idea of, what's best for the other person. Here's this dad who's like, no, I just have no idea. I just need you to help me, to tell me, first of all, what he actually wants and what he needs, and how do I kind of get him there? So when we're thinking of integrity, kind of molding these ideas together, you see a lot of times integrity kind of happens in the way that's like we sort of get to see behind the veil often, like what actually people think about us and whether they actually do have our best interests at heart. So it's like,
Yeah.
I guess I wish we had more of these moments, where it's like we don't have to kind of do the guesswork of trying to figure out like, okay, this person says that he or she wants what's best for me. I mean, even though they're acting like it, how do I really know? How can I tell? I mean, I guess I would wonder, are there other ways besides somebody telling us like, oh well, this is what this person thinks about you when you're not around? Are there any other ways that we can start to build or continue to build integrity with other people?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And part of, for the integrity piece, when I think about pulling that lever, a lot of it is around having our actions align and being clear about, okay, so because with my kids, I talk about having a relentlessly positive story.
Mm-hmm.
And so I tell that story to them, but then when they come to me with new information, they see it start to play out, because I'll start asking questions about the other actors, about the situation, about what was going on, and I assume the best of them to start. And partly that's about having this sort of positive story, but also about referencing back to that, because you're right. I think a big chunk of the mental health struggles that we have are a defective story that we've got running in our head.
Mm-hmm.
And as a parent, part of the role that I play is creating a safe harbor, creating a place where my sons feel safe and accepted and loved and appreciated so that they can go out and take risks in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so part of what I do is, I mean, I'm in a bit of a privileged space because I get to tell wonderful stories about my sons in public places like this.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So on this podcast, I'll tell you, my sons are the center of my life.
Mm-hmm.
They mean everything to me, and they're incredible human beings. And I dedicated my book to them. They make me want to be a better person. And so I get this great opportunity to say this, knowing that at some point they may stumble across this podcast and listen to it and know this is what Dad says about me. And it's the experience that I have of him as well.
Mm-hmm.
Right. That there's this consistency.
Right.
And so part of that is telling our friends the positive story we have about our kids and helping them reinterpret events through a positive lens. And we could do the same thing with people we work with. I run into so many people who have this sort of confidence gap. It seems to happen more often with women, where they are remarkably competent, but lack confidence and are convinced that they're just a hair's breadth away from being fired.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
And you go back and you reinterpret the world for them through a more positive lens, and it's compelling, right? But it needs to happen multiple times. They need to be reassured over and over again. And we need to help people build a more positive narrative about themselves. And that's one of the ways we show benevolence as well. And I'll tell you one of my favorite stories is my younger son Alexander, incredibly funny and observant and intelligent and late. Right. So I came to understand through one of the courses I was sitting in on parenting with a woman named Allison Reese, that we have these individual traits, and sometimes we have stronger versions of those, and they come with strengths and weaknesses. And he was highly distractible, which meant that he was observant and empathetic and all these wonderful traits, but he was also late all the time. And he's gotten much better at it as he's gotten older, but when he was a young boy, he struggled mightily with it. And there was a day that I was standing outside waiting for him. And, I'm waiting for him outside his school, and we only get a certain amount of time together. And so there's some anxiety around that, about us losing time. And all the other kids have come out, and the teachers have come out, and the janitor's trying to lock up the building, and he finally comes out of the school. And he approaches me, and his feet are dragging, his head is down. And while I'm waiting, I'm realizing I have a choice. I can be frustrated and angry with him for being late, or I can accept him for all that he is and realize that this isn't intentional. right? That he's not trying to send me a message about my importance or any of those things. This is just him. And I can either accept him and love him for all that he is or not. And so he approaches me and he says, Dad, I'm really sorry I'm late. And I thought, I can yell at him like everyone else has been doing, but it's not changing the behavior. And so I just said to him, buddy, you're worth the wait. And that acceptance in that moment was powerful for him. And it was powerful for our relationship. And so that became my mantra from then on. You're worth the wait.
Yeah,
and
I love that.
Yeah, and no one's more important than you are to me. And whoever's coming next, they can wait.
Yeah, and then when you were thinking about, again, like these sort of cognitive constructs, right? How did you overcome the personalization aspect of it? Because I mean, it's really easy to just say, well, this is a chronic pattern. This is happening to me. Obviously, he's not taking me seriously.
Right. And that's one of the challenges we face, right? Is letting go of our own ego and realizing that, we're the center of our own world, but we're not the center of everybody else's world.
Right.
And I'd seen the pattern happen often enough, and I knew that he loved me, and that I loved him fiercely, and what he really needed was acceptance. And my sons are different, right? They have different interests and different things that they're passionate about, and different spikes, and they're both amazing, but they're slightly different. And at one point, he said to me, "I'm sorry, I'm not more like my older brother Thomas." And I said, "Wow, buddy, I spend zero time wishing you were somebody else." I wouldn't want you to be anything other than who and what you are. And so we need to take our opportunities to affirm those things. And I grew up with a father who was a perfectionist and who never gave me credit for any kind of success. And I was very determined not to be that. Perfect was just okay. It created an insecure overachiever. And I wanted my sons to have a stable bedrock foundation from which to leap from, to take risks in the world, to be fearless, to know that there was always a safe place for them.
Yeah, and this makes me think of something that Alan would say, that when we would talk about just like what it's, remember that conversation that we had when we were talking about like, what is it like if you just tell yourself a different story if you're going outside, like if you're just like going out into the world, and let's say you're going on a train, because remember we talked about like the somewhat of the phobia that you had about trains. And if you tell yourself the story of like, yeah, these people aren't going to necessarily harm me, or they're not going to try to do that. So, but that's what we're talking about, right? Sort of de-egoizing it.
So right. I mean, yeah. So, I mean, I think what you're talking about though is kind of like your beliefs about other people in general.
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, sure. I used to have a little bit of a higher anxiety, a little higher neuroticism. So if I'd go on, let's say, the train here in New York, I'm thinking, what is this person thinking of me? Oh, they looked funny in my direction, or how am I coming off to them? And all these things that are a little too self-conscious and not really kind of being in the moment, and
very personal, very personal.
Sure. Yeah. And it felt automatic, even if I logicized it or intellectualized that they weren't, that it's in my head, it still was so automatic and ingrained that it was very hard to sort of unwire. But yeah, I started to try to adapt this perspective of, like maybe everyone in the world is just like you, right? With these same kinds of worries, or maybe everyone here is maybe, everyone in their head either thinks they're like, everyone thinks they're the good guy, right? Everyone wants to be right. Everyone wants to come off well, generally speaking. It's possible that everyone here is like a potential friend of mine, maybe, like, and the world isn't so hostile. Now, was that the point that you were really?
Yeah, that was it. Because we were talking about like sort of personalizing, and the idea is like, so what I was asking Darryl, right, is how do you get out of that framework of like, oh, well, this says something negative about me?
Just to tag and add that something there. I mean, there could be a million different variables, or an infinite number of variables that contribute to, let's say, somebody being late, for instance. It might not be something against you. It could be something else in their environment, something else that they're thinking about, maybe something that happened to them a week ago. It could be just that they're just distracted by something that that's going on and has nothing to do with you at all. and
Right.
it's not personal. It's not something that it's against you, and that's why it's sometimes easier to accept. Because I mean, if you think that it's against you, of course, yeah, you're gonna form an ego around it, react to what they're doing. It's a personal slight against you. It
Right.
creates this whole chain of feedback that leads to negative outcomes. But if you realize that there could be a whole bunch of things contributing to their, like even at work, let's say if somebody is late, is it really a slight against me or the leadership or the people there, or is it just, hey, it's remote, maybe some equipment wasn't working, maybe
Right.
it's not that. Even if it was a little more of say it's even, let's give it even let's say it's negative, let's say it's actually that they are let's say they're pretending that their equipment isn't working or something like that.
Right.
Even if it's that, it's still not really a slight against you or the company. In a sense, I mean, it's not good for performance or for productivity, but at least when you're not personalizing it, there's more resources freed up so that you can sort of have a conversation with that person and come from a different person, as opposed to this negative, this is against me perspective.
Right.
Maybe like, what can we do to sort of change your perception of work, so this way this doesn't happen again, where you don't pretend that your equipment doesn't work. Maybe
Right.
what's the purpose here? Can we get maybe let's talk about the purpose of what we're doing here, and maybe that'll be like your North Star that helps you to not have these negative feelings around work, or getting
Right.
stuck in the automaticity of things, in the sense that, like, it's another day at work. This is,
Right.
this, I have to do this for that paycheck, for this, for that. But when you create some sort of a purpose around it that they could resonate with, and you have to find what they resonate with, like you said, like maybe depending on who your audience is, you might frame it as, this is what's going to bring you more value, depending on who you're speaking to. You might say, this is what's going to move you up in the company to a different person. It might say, this will build up this skill, which maybe you can suss out that that's what's important to them. It's context dependent, but there are ways to sort of, by not reacting, by not egotizing. Is that a word? Egotizing?
I would use that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Egotizing. Sure. Yeah. By not reacting, essentially. Yeah. You then are still, you have more of those resources to be able to have that conversation.
Right.
Yeah. And not have that be something that's a barrier to your success or their success.
Right. And then
Absolutely.
so for Darryl, right? So I think this kind of is a great segue into the next topic, which I think should be vulnerability, right? So now how do we get to that point where instead of just sort of defending, instead of creating a defense and just barricading ourselves like from us and the person, right? This kind of whatever, like this middle ground between us. How do we get to the point where, we're able to say like, hey man, here's this thing that like it really hurt my feelings. Like, I would just want to understand like what is actually going on with you, because what we tend to do is we just, tend to say, you're an asshole. I can't believe you did this to me. I never want to talk to you again. Or if you're like a boss, it's, here's your punishment, whatever that may be. Right.
Right.
So how does vulnerability play into this? Right. And how do we start to think about vulnerability in a way that's sort of, more sort of practical, not manualized, but more sort of practical, right? What sort of steps would we need to start to take?
Yeah, and this is the conversation where people become uncomfortable, right? Because they struggle to talk about vulnerability. And we start a lot of times by realizing that vulnerability is such a subjective thing. When I was a doctoral student, I had some good friends of mine ask me to come play poker, said it's, $20. And it's just for fun, right? Well, so as a doctoral student, $20 was a lot. Right. And I felt this profound sense of anxiety, not only around the money, but around my friendships with them and what they were going to think of me. And I didn't think I was a very good poker player. And so I thought, well, this $20 is gone. Right. You move forward and you've actually got a real job. $20 doesn't feel like that big a deal. Right. And so it's around scarcity. And in part, we start by thinking about how is the other person vulnerable, but we try to have the conversation about what they think is at stake. And because our vulnerability is a combination of both the actual level of vulnerability we're experiencing and the exaggerations that we have. And so we may think we're far more vulnerable than we actually are, or we may think we're far less vulnerable than we really are. And so starting to have those conversations around vulnerability. And one of the things we can do is initiate by going first, right? We can initiate norms of reciprocity by being a little bit vulnerable ourselves first. Saying, here's what I think is at stake in this. Is that consistent with what you think is at stake?
Mm-hmm.
And and if things went wrong, here's what I would, here's what I think some of the alternatives are. Is that aligned for you, or are there other things you can think of? And as we start discussing alternatives and making it easier for folks, that sense of vulnerability starts to fade a little bit. And one of the challenges we're seeing in organizations is that a lot of times people have a fairly set level of vulnerability, right? It's where their job is, it's where they get paid, it's where their future aspirations are, their sense of self, their identity. All of those things are tied up in this. And then we start to see massive fluctuations and uncertainty on the other side, and that causes our perception of risk to bounce. And it makes people really uncomfortable. And so they start to try to disengage. They start to try to become less vulnerable, look for other options. And who leaves first? The best people leave first because they've got the best options. And so we need to understand how people are feeling vulnerable. And we can take steps to reduce that for folks, right? By giving them more options, by providing insurance. If it's an organization, we can have good outplacement programs. Or if I'm a leader and I've got some good people that I work with, actually shining a light on them for the rest of the organization, so that if my unit loses headcount, there's a better chance that they're going to be picked up by somebody else within the organization. These are all ways that we can take steps to reduce their vulnerability. And so, this is one of the places where my research sort of is in addition to a lot of the other trust research, because most trust research doesn't talk about vulnerability. And so it treats trust like a dichotomous variable, right? Like it's either present or absent, like an old school light switch.
Mm-hmm.
And, all you have to do is say to people, well, we trust some people more than others. And they go, well, of course we do, right? Like, how did this guy get a PhD? But overwhelmingly, that's where our heads go. And so, one of the struggles we face is this profound lack of awareness about our own vulnerability, or how to handle that or manage it, or somebody else's. And so by starting to bring these things forward with conversation and a little bit of empathy, trying to do some perspective taking, we can actually take steps to say, well, how is this other person vulnerable? And then how could we take steps to make them more comfortable, to allow them to at least start in the relationship? How can, you think about ice cream parlors that allow you a taste before you buy the whole cone, right? Mm-hmm. So they let you have a small bit of vulnerability. So you say, hey, I'd like to try the rum raisin. And then you discover that you don't like rum or raisin, right? And so you don't have a whole cone of it. You just had one mouthful of food. And so if we can think about ways that we reduce people's vulnerability, and we see organizations do this all the time with generous return policies, with try before you buy, like all of those kinds of things are ways for us to reduce vulnerability for somebody else, so they don't feel like the decision's catastrophic if they go wrong.
Yeah, that made me think. No, go ahead.
What are you going to say about the podcast?
What?
Okay. Well, what's fascinating is, technically speaking, I mean, this goes without saying, but yeah, we do the podcast, of course, for free. Not that we're expecting any kind of, monetary value. Of course, that's great. And with advertisements and that's fantastic. And many podcasts have that sort of model, right? But in general, just doing it for free, I could kind of see that as, that's us being vulnerable, right? I mean,
Yes.
And also, in a sense, we're being consistent by releasing every single week. Mm-hmm. So we have that integrity, right? I'm not trying to have an ego around it, but I'm just saying, like, if I had to be objective for a second,
I think you're doing what I do on dates.
Whoops.
No, but I get your point. No, you're right. So the point is that
but that laugh was a signal that that's where I should.
No, it's all good.
No, but we could, but I think, yeah, it could be related to the podcast in the sense,
Yeah.
benevolence, right?
So, so
Yeah,
there's a
sorry.
so there's a great her name is Jane Freeman. She's I think she's a publicist, right? So what I really like about her ideas is that like, so if she teaches like courses on like writing, right? Not necessarily
Okay.
not writing, it's more like writing publicity, right? So she'll often tell writers, she'll say something like, look guys, like I know when you go on podcasts you want to sort of like hold back as much as possible because you want readers, potential readers obviously, to buy your books, you want them to like inquire into your work and maybe other ways, articles, blogs, whatever, right? But so she's like, the thing that I kind of teach them is that like you shouldn't do that. You should actually just be as generous as possible. So it's like if you go on a podcast and like the host or let's say listeners or whatnot, they ask you questions, just answer the questions. Like don't do that. Don't be that person who just like is stingy with their work. I get she's like, I understand obviously this is a market, you're doing this for a living, totally. But what she says is essentially generosity begets more generosity. So the idea is like, there you go. And that's sort of what vulnerability is too. Sort of the more vulnerable you are, the more benevolent you are, the more integrity you have toward the other person, the more you kind of get it in return. And so that's what I sort of love about just relationships with people is there's a kind of symbiosis there where it's like the more you give, the more you get. But often, and I mean, again, this makes sense in our kind of in our sort of very neurotic, I guess, society or economy where we try to keep as much to ourselves as possible and say, okay, we'll give you like a little bit, but the rest of it you have to buy. And so interestingly, from her perspective, it's not that. She's like, no, I promise you, if you don't give away your entire book, obviously, right? She's like, people will be interested. And if anything, they're going to have a, going back to your spiral, right? They have a positive perception of you, which in turn, kind of like, again, fosters whatever, sort of propounds on itself. So where you have like, you have a good podcast, the person listens to you, they're like, hey, wow, like this person just gave us a bunch of great information about her book. I want to kind of look into it some more. Maybe I want to buy it, right? Or maybe I want to listen to another podcast with her on to get more details before I make a decision. But the idea again is that generosity, right? It's sort of it fosters or fuels curiosity, and you already you have a positive perception formed in the other person's head, literally just by giving. That's it. That's all.
Yeah.
It takes. Yeah.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. And so for me, I'm trying to get the signal through the noise. I'm trying to help people build stronger relationships. That's my passion. And so it's, I want everyone to read the book, not because I want the money I get from selling the book, but more because I want this to actually start to change behaviors. And so whenever I'm talking to folks, if they ask me a question, I'll answer as honestly and completely as I can. And there's a bunch of free content on my website, that people can go and read and listen to. And I try to be as generous and as giving as I can for exactly that reason. I believe that, my purpose, my mission is to actually make the world a better place. And I feel like I'm dropping small grains of sand in the ocean, creating these little tiny ripples. And I want people to come alongside me and pick up great big rocks.
Yeah, wow. I love that so much. So, all right, kind of been starting to wrap things up, Alan. Any final questions for Darryl before we go?
Oh, yes. So if you wanted to follow your work, buy the book, where could we find you and buy the book as well?
So the website's trustunlimited.com, and there's a blog section there that has a bunch of stuff on it for free. The book is called Building Trust, Exceptional Leadership in an Uncertain World. And it's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, for Canadians, Chapters, and Indigo. It's available in hardcover and electronic, and it's going to be out as an Audible book fairly soon as well.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so I'm really hoping that folks will talk about it, share it. I was at a conference, and I know we're wrapping up, but I was at a conference a few weeks ago at Duke, where they were talking about rebuilding trust in institutions. And overwhelmingly, they said, things are really bad. And when asked, okay, well, how do we fix it? The response was, well, we just don't know. And I don't think that's the right answer. I think we do know. We just need a better publicist, right? We just need more people aware of how to use the model and how to think about it. It's possible.
I love that. All right, Darryl, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, man.
Thanks,
this is awesome.
Absolutely, man. We'll talk to you soon.
Take care.
Thanks.
Okay. Well, guys, again, the book is called Building Trust. It could be found on online retailers such as Amazon, and of course, where Darryl pointed us towards as well. Links will be in the description as well. And guys, if you want to follow us, you can follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and at Seize_podcast on Twitter. Like, subscribe,
Hit the bell.
the bell. Again, thanks for watching. Keep seizing the moment and see you next time.